Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to dive into a seriously fascinating primary source, Reverend Sun Myung Moon's 1984 speech titled, "For God So Loves the World." We're going to impartially unpack the incredibly complex theology and the geopolitical framework he presents here. Whether you're studying 20th century religious movements or Cold War era ideologies, this text offers such a specific lens on how spiritual beliefs can just totally intersect with global politics. It's a dynamic that's still so relevant for understanding ideological movements today. So we're going to look strictly at what the text itself argues, breaking down its core concepts so you can grasp the exact logic it uses to construct its worldview.
All right, so here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the nature of true belief, then the law of responsibility, followed by the modern spiritual crisis, America as the microcosm, and finally, the unification mission.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the nature of true belief. We'll start with the very foundation of the text, where Reverend Moon actually redefines the nature of Christian faith.
The text anchors itself on, arguably, the most famous Bible verse of all time, John 3:16. But it asks the listener to make this really fascinating fundamental shift in focus. While a lot of people look directly to the promise of eternal life at the end of that verse, this speech points right back to the very first half of the sentence, "For God so loved the world."
It sharply contrasts a traditional interpretation, which it views as focusing mostly on individual salvation and personal belief, with a much, much grander vision. According to the speech, Jesus didn't come to just save isolated individuals, or even a specific church. No, he came because God loved the entire world, the whole universe. Therefore, true belief actually means taking responsibility for the entire universe, not just your own individual soul.
Building on that, the speech launches a pretty sharp critique of modern churches. The text argues that traditional Christianity has failed because believers have just become too individualistic. It actually uses this striking metaphor, comparing these believers to a thief who wants all the blessings without putting in any of the hard work. It claims that modern churches are completely mixed with secular values and sin, arguing that true believers really need to actively separate themselves from these worldly corruptions, rather than just compromising with them.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the law of responsibility. This brings us right to the core mechanism of Moon's theology. The text poses a highly provocative question. If God is almighty, and if God is loving, why did he allow his own son, Jesus, to suffer and die unrighteously on the cross? And, by extension, why does God allow righteous people today to suffer persecution? Well, to answer this, the speech introduces a cosmic rule.
And the crucial point here is this concept of indemnity. The speech claims that indemnity is a universal law. Think of it like gravity, rigid and absolutely fundamental. It explains that God does not intervene in human affairs, not even to save his own son, because doing so would actually violate human responsibility. So according to the text, humans have to actively endure hardship and make a real effort to separate from sin if they want to prove themselves worthy of God's direct love.
This concept then builds out into a literal roadmap for salvation. The text outlines this long, systematic climb that's required to completely separate from Satan. You can't just skip to the end. The effort of indemnity has to be fulfilled at the individual level first. Then it has to spread to the family, the society, the nation, the entire world, and finally, the cosmos. It's presented as this completely unavoidable requirement for all of humanity.
Which brings us to Section 3, the modern spiritual crisis. Now that the rules are established, the speech pivots dramatically to the intense geopolitical realities of 1984.
The speech frames this global Cold War conflict using incredibly vivid metaphors. Communism is described not just as a political system, but as an invading germ. America? Well, America is the sick patient whose white blood cells are failing, or like a house that's literally on fire. And Reverend Moon positions his movement as the necessary doctor or the firefighter, arriving just in time to stop the infection and put out the flames.
The speech goes on to argue that the world is crying out in agony, almost like a dying animal plagued by specific spiritual and social diseases. It points to the global spread of communism, for sure, but also to internal rot, things like rampant drug addiction, what the text calls the moral decay of free sex, and ultimately, the complete breakdown of the family unit. In the logic of this speech, these aren't just isolated or random social issues. They are deeply interconnected symptoms of a dying world that's under a direct spiritual attack.
Now we hit Section 4, America as the microcosm. Here, the narrative sharply narrows its focus directly on the United States.
framing it as the ultimate deciding battleground.
What's really striking here is that the text presents America as more than just a wealthy superpower. It's framed as a divine model. Because America is a nation of immigrants blending all these different backgrounds together, the speech argues it was uniquely designed by God to be a microcosm of the world, essentially an ideal society meant to transcend race and nationality, setting the perfect example for a unified global family.
But the speech issues a stark, really urgent warning. It contrasts an America centered on God, acting like solid concrete holding a society together, with an America that turns its back on God. Without that divine unifying force, the text argues that America becomes like sand. It crumbles, it divides, and it's easily washed away by the flood of communism. It even points to moral decay in major cities like New York and Chicago as hard evidence that the concrete is, right now, failing.
To address the intense skepticism and, frankly, the persecution from his critics at the time, Moon uses a rhetorical question. Why is he, a Korean preacher, interfering in American affairs? Well, based on the logic we just walked through, his answer is that America is the ultimate linchpin for global salvation. If America falls, the whole world falls. He argues that he's there because he knows God's grieving heart, and he's desperately trying to save the nation before it's too late.
And finally, we reach Section 5, the Unification Mission. This is where the text proposes its specific, actionable resolution to cure the crisis.
To combat the ideological threat of communism, the speech introduces a counter-ideology called Godism. And this is absolutely crucial. It defines Godism as an ideology that's totally God-centered, but does not insist on uniformity of belief. Instead, it's pitched as this broad ecumenical tool designed to bring Christians and people of all different religions together into one unified front to protect the free world.
As a direct physical application of this theology, the text points to the highly controversial practice of intercultural marriages. It specifically positions organizing marriages between black and white individuals as a deliberate, urgent strategy to literally blend humanity together and prevent future bloodshed. It's presented as the practical, real-world application of building that single global family.
The text concludes with a truly sweeping vision. The goal isn't just about an afterlife in heaven. No, the stated mission is to transform the entire physical planet into one unified family under God, completely eradicating all racial, national, and religious boundaries. And importantly, as the quote emphasizes, we will build it with our hands. It brings everything right back to that core principle we discussed earlier, individual human responsibility.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. We've just seen how this text meticulously weaves biblical interpretation together with intense Cold War anxieties and strict codes of personal responsibility. Regardless of your personal beliefs, analyzing primary sources like this helps us understand exactly how ideologies construct their worldviews. So, what do you think? How do the fears and the hopes expressed in this 1984 speech echo in the historical and sociological landscapes of our world today? It's a pretty fascinating question to consider as you continue your own research. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.